right, welcome to our space day. So I told you on Fridays and possibly Thursdays that we would be exploring topics of interest. So one of the topics that has seemed to generate the most interest has been astronomy or space. So what we're going to look at this Friday and next Friday are the two space disasters in the space shuttle program. So today we're going to start with the Challenger. And what we're going to do is I'm going to give you some background information, kind of like a news article, who, what, when, where, why, and how, about the Challenger disaster. And then I'm also going to put a second video up where I show you some of the diagrams of the space shuttle and actually what happened to it throughout the 73 seconds of the launch all the way to the 2 minutes and 43 seconds when it hit the Atlantic Ocean. Following those two videos will be a CNN report of live footage of the Challenger disaster in the space program. So this is not for a grade, it's just for information. And I've been getting a lot of questions about wanting to know more about space, including the space shuttle program, ever since we started talking about the Apollo program or the Moon program. So let's start with the who. And you're going to see me referring to notes because I want to get the facts correct. So when we talk about the Space Shuttle Challenger, there were 7 astronauts aboard that space shuttle. And what made this mission so interesting is there was a civilian on it. Civilian means like an average everyday person, not an astronaut. And that civilian was a teacher. And she was going to be the first teacher in space, and her name was Krista McAuliffe, and she was from New Hampshire. I believe she was a math teacher. I could be wrong about that, but she was definitely from New Hampshire. So right around this area, right, in the East Coast. Besides Krista McAuliffe, we had Gregory Jarvis, Judith Resnick, Dick Scobie, who was actually the commander of the Space Shuttle Challenger, Ronald McNair, Mike Smith, and Ellison Onizuka. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And this was the 10th mission of that Space Shuttle Challenger. The first launch of that space shuttle was on April 4th of 1983. This was only the second shuttle in the space program, and they usually go on a certain amount of missions before they're retired. So this would have been the 10th mission of this particular shuttle. It took place on January 28th, 1986, so that was kind of the when part. And the liftoff was 11:39 a.m. and reached about an altitude of 46,000 feet before disaster started to strike. When we talk about what happened, we will look at this more closely when we look at the diagram so you can see the shuttle. But it's important to understand why this disaster took place. Initially, they described it as an explosion. About 73 seconds after liftoff, you saw this giant fireball in the sky. The shuttle didn't actually explode. It looked like an explosion. We'll talk about why in a second. But what happened is, on the shuttle, there are different parts. You have the orbiter, which actually contains the astronauts and anything they're bringing with them. If they're bringing equipment for experiments, they call it the payload, whatever the orbiter is carrying, people and experiments and things of that nature. You have the external tank, which is like a giant fuel tank that has different pieces to it. Oxygen's in one part of the tank, liquid hydrogen's in another part, so both liquid oxygen and hydrogen. And then you have 2 external boosters on either side of the tank. They're like rockets, and those 2 external boosters help launch the shuttle out of Earth's orbit. Now, those external boosters are attached to the external tank, or the fuel tank or gas tank, if you want to think of it that way, with something called O-rings, and they're kind of like rubber rings. And they don't function so well in cold weather. And that's exactly what happened on January 28th. The flight had already been delayed by 6 days. They were supposed to take off 6 days or launch 6 days before January 28th, but the weather wasn't cooperating. It was unusually cold, even for that time of year, in Cape Canaveral, Florida, because that's where the launches take place. So despite warnings that some of the equipment might not function properly in that cold weather, they still launched, and there's a lot of debate as to why that may have happened and why warnings were ignored. So the seal that was designed in those O-rings to prevent leaks from that gas tank actually weakened because of the cold temperatures during liftoff. So when that happened, hot gas started to leak out from that external tank, the liquid hydrogen, the liquid oxygen, and that's what created that fireball type of look, because you were seeing the hot gases escaping. It wasn't so much exploding as it was escaping. And that happened about 46,000 feet. When that started to happen and the gas started to leak out, the fuel tank collapsed and actually tore apart. And it'll be hard to see in the video, but the diagrams will show you that in more detail. So it like ripped right apart from that. And when that liquid hydrogen and oxygen released, that's what created that fireball look that you'll see in the CNN footage. Now, a lot of people initially thought because it was an explosion, the astronauts died 46,000 feet into the launch, which was about 73 seconds into it when that fireball look from the gases leaking out happened. But what's sad about this is that they realized that the astronauts were alive when this was happening. And as that external tank started to rip apart, the orbiter, which was carrying them, kept ascending, kept going up to about 65,000 feet. And as they were going up rapidly, they probably lost consciousness because of the change in oxygen levels and the change in cabin pressure. 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the launch, so after that initial leak, after them continuing to ascend, the orbiter carrying them came down 200 miles an hour and hit the Atlantic Ocean. So imagine hitting something at 200 miles an hour. And what they're unsure of is if at that point of impact, if some of those astronauts would have regained consciousness as it was descending back down and may have realized what was coming, which is really sad to think about. Obviously, no one would survive that kind of impact taking place. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to pull up some diagrams on the computer so you won't see my face anymore talking about it. And I'll show you the different parts that I mentioned so you can get a better idea of what happened. But it was the first major tragedy in the space shuttle program. There were tragedies in the Apollo program, but this was a space shuttle program. It was the first tragedy. And after this, the space shuttle program took a break of 2 years to kind of redesign and to think about what went wrong and how to avoid issues like this in the future.